Part 1. Darkness Inside. Jonathan Clark always looked like your average Joe. At least, that's what his neighbors, co-workers, and random acquaintances thought. Tall, skinny, with decent features, but his look was pretty plain, even boring. He worked at a small building supply store in suburban St. Louis, rented a modest apartment, and didn't have any close pals. Nobody ever guessed he was a predator. Every night, when the city was asleep, Jonathan hit the streets. He wasn't into clubs or rowdy bars, and he didn't do aimless walks. There was only one thing on his mind: the thrill of finding a new victim. It all started by accident. 4 years back, when he was 26, he'd been working late and was walking home along an empty street. That's when he saw a girl walking ahead of him. She was alone, glued to her phone, not paying attention to her surroundings. He got closer and heard her chatting on the phone about trivial stuff. Where she'd been, what she'd bought, when she'd be back. He barely remembers what happened next. Before he knew it, one hand was on her shoulder and the other had clamped over her mouth. She didn't even get a chance to scream. He hadn't planned on killing her, but when he felt her body twitch in agony, he realized he loved it. From that moment on, he couldn't stop. Jonathan wasn't an idiot. He didn't go hunting every night. He could wait months until that same burning urge, like a dark force demanding release, took over. His methods got more refined, more careful, no stupid risks, just quiet, fast, and efficient kills. He never repeated a mistake, never left a trace. That's why the cops never caught on. To them, a random maniac was on the loose, a serial killer with no clear pattern or link between victims. But he knew there was order in the chaos. And tonight, his next hunt was on. Jonathan sat in his car, parked on the edge of town, near an old motel. He watched the exit where a bunch of drunk kids were leaving a bar. Most of them were in groups, laughing loudly and clueless that one of them would make tonight their last memory. He waited patiently, then finally, she appeared. A lone, short girl with dark hair, slowly walking down the sidewalk, lost in her phone. The perfect target. He took a deep breath, feeling a warm thrill spread through his chest. He started the engine. The hunt had begun. Part 2, Shadow Tracks. The car was creeping along, practically silent. Jonathan knew that rushing was his enemy. He'd studied his targets, tracked their moves, and figured out their habits. He wasn't just out to kill. He was in total control. The girl hadn't noticed him yet. She was walking at a steady pace, occasionally stopping to type a quick text on her phone. Jonathan eased up even more, gliding behind her like a cat on the prowl. But then, something went sideways. She suddenly stopped and glanced back. Jonathan froze. Their eyes met for a split second, and he saw confusion flash in hers. She took a step back, and he could feel her instincts kicking in, her mind racing, telling her to run. He wasn't about to let that happen. In a heartbeat, Jonathan slammed on the gas. The girl bolted, sprinting away into the night. Part 3. The Predator's Mistake. The girl suddenly veered into a dark alley. Jonathan didn't see it coming. He hit the brakes, trying to size up the scene. The alley was narrow, littered with trash, and barely visible in the darkness. It didn't look like a safe spot even for a psycho, but his target definitely knew where she was headed. He stepped out of the car and looked around, only silence and the weak flicker of a street lamp above. He took a step forward, breathing in the cool night air. His heart was steady, just like it always was before an attack. But this time, something felt off. She didn't seem like the usual prey. Then out of nowhere, he heard movement behind him. He barely had time to turn when something heavy slammed into his back. Jonathan crumpled onto the dirty asphalt. He tried to get up, but a sharp pain shot through his side. This wasn't a random blow. The hit was calculated. The girl stood over him, her eyes glinting in the dark and a knife clutched in her hand. "You thought I was your victim," she said, her voice calm and almost indifferent. Leaning in closer, her breath brushed against his face. "I've been waiting for someone like you. You're not the first to hunt me. And you know what? I hunt too." Jonathan's mind started to fog. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Whether from shock or something else, he knew it was all over. "You're way too cocky," she continued, carefully dragging the knife along his jacket. "You killed because you thought people were just prey. But not all of them are weak." Desperation raced through his mind as he searched for a way out. He was the one who always controlled the hunt, always the predator. But this time, nothing went according to his plan. His final thoughts were about all the things he could have done differently. Part 4. The Reversed Hunt. Jonathan woke up in total darkness. His body felt cold and heavy. He tried to move, but his hands were tied. The air was damp and heavy, with the taste of metal and blood, his own blood. In the distance, he could hear footsteps. She was here. "You really think you're the first one I've caught?" Her voice echoed in the cramped space. "No, Jonathan. I've known for a long time that monsters walk among us, and I learned how to hunt them." Slowly, he realized he was in some kind of basement. His body was strapped down with belts, and his head was spinning from blood loss. He tried to remember how he ended up here. Only fragments came back. He remembered the pain, the fall, and then nothing but darkness. The girl leaned over him, her eyes void of fear, just pure curiosity. "What do you feel now? Fear? Rage? Or maybe finally some understanding?" "Don't know who you're messing with," he rasped, trying to hide his own terror. She laughed. "I know more than you think. I've been watching you. You're not as clever as you believe. Your methods are predictable." Turning around, she picked something off a table, a knife. Not the one you saw in the alley earlier. This one was big, sharp, and cold. "I don't kill right off the bat," she said. "You need to understand why you're here. You need to feel the fear. The very same fear those you killed felt." Jonathan used to get a kick out of his victim's terror. He believed that fear was power, that it meant control. But now, fear had taken over him. His whole body shivered, his heart pounding in his chest. She leaned even closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always win." For the first time in his life, Jonathan Clark felt what he'd only seen in the eyes of his victims. He knew then, this was his end. Part 5. The Predator's Cage. As the darkness slowly pulled back, Jonathan felt the cold air wrap around him, sending shivers all over. He was strapped to a metal chair, with weak-ass lamps casting long shadows on the basement walls. His arms were tied up so tight, he could barely feel his fingers. "What are you doing?" he managed to choke out, his voice weak, but still laced with anger. The girl stood there, with her arms crossed, just watching him. "I'm giving you a chance. You love games, don't you?" She ran her finger along a metal blade. "Let's play." "You're bluffing," he muttered, feeling his body start to go numb from the cold. She smiled. "You sure about that? You know what it's like, to feel in control, to own the fear. But tonight, you ain't the hunter, Jonathan. Tonight, you're the prey." She stepped back and flipped a switch. Soon, a dull sound filled the air. The slow drip of water from the ceiling, steadily filling the room. "Water," he whispered, trying to figure out her plan. "You got 2 hours," she said, coolly. "While the water rises, you can try to find a way out. But here's the catch. One wrong move and it speeds up. The game is on." Jonathan tensed up. This was something new, something he hadn't expected. Fear was no longer his tool. It had become his prison. Water slowly pooled around his feet, cold and sticky. He remembered his victims, how they begged for their lives, how terrified they were. He always thought they were weak, stupid, helpless. And now, here he was, in their shoes. "Why?" His voice cracked as the water reached his bones. "Why are you doing this?" "'Cause you're just like them," she shot back, sitting on a table in front of him. "You thought you were special? That only you could hunt? Well, there are those who hunt you. We've always been here. You just never saw us." Jonathan knew every move could be his last, but he wasn't about to give up. He'd been a hunter all his life. He'd find a way out. Slowly, he started wiggling his fingers. Gradually, blood began pumping back into his limbs. If he could free his hands, he might still fight back. He had a chance. "You really think I'm going to let you give me a chance to escape?" The girl sneered as she leaned in closer. "I know what you're trying to do, but you don't get it. In this game, you don't call the shots." Suddenly, she jerked a lever, and the water's flow cranked up, rushing through the basement and already soaking his knees. Jonathan felt the cold seeping into his bones. Panic started to take over. He jerked violently, but the straps held him down tight. He tried to keep it together, but the realization of the inevitable was crushing. The water was now up to his waist. He'd lost control. Now he was just fighting to survive. Part 6. The flooded trap. Water kept rushing in like a cold, relentless wave. It was already up to Jonathan's chest, and his breathing turned ragged. His whole body started shivering from the chill, while his mind raced, desperately hunting for an escape. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. He'd always been the hunter, and now he was the prey. "You feel that, don't you?" The girl's voice cut through the sound of dripping water. She was sitting on a table, legs crossed, watching him with a disturbingly calm gaze. "That's fear. The very same fear you made all your victims feel when there was nowhere to run." Jonathan quickly assessed his situation. His hands were still tied, but he could sense the ropes were loosening a bit from all the moisture. He tensed every muscle, jerked his wrists hard, and felt the fabric start to tear. Meanwhile, the water kept rising, creeping up to his neck and forcing him to take short, panicked gasps. Panic was swallowing him whole. He'd always relished in his victim's terror, but now that same terror was his reality. "You know what people fear most?" She leaned in even closer. "Not pain, not death. They fear helplessness, the thought that nobody's coming to save them. That's why you hunted, wasn't it? You wanted to feel powerful, to watch your prey writhing completely at your mercy. But look at you now." Jonathan gritted his teeth as the water gushed into his mouth. His only choice was to muster every bit of strength left in him. He concentrated, pulled at his wrists one more time. Finally, the The straps snapped. One hand was free. Without wasting a second, he grabbed the other strap and tore it apart in one furious motion, freeing himself completely. The water was nearly at his chin now. He flipped over the chair and scrambled to find any point of leverage, but the basement was almost completely flooded. The girl strolled over to the door and grabbed the handle. Let's see if you can make it out before the water does its thing. Jonathan ignored her taunts. He scanned the room and spotted something, a ventilation grate in the corner. That was his only shot. He made a desperate lunge, plunging into the rising water, and swam toward the grate. His lungs burned with each stroke, but sheer terror propelled him forward. He grabbed onto the cold metal grid and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. He tried again, putting every ounce of strength into it. Suddenly, the metal creaked and the grate gave way. Jonathan shoved himself through into a dark tunnel, tearing free from the trap. His hands scraped along the slick, slimy walls as his heart pounded like crazy. He crawled forward, gulping in precious air, his body screaming with exhaustion, but he couldn't afford to stop. Behind him, he could hear the clatter of metal. She was still on his tail, but she wasn't in a mad rush. She knew he was spent. In a final, desperate glance, their eyes met just as he vanished into the ventilation passage. She didn't look enraged or shocked. She simply smiled. "Run, Jonathan. But know this, I'll find you." He burst out into the cold night air. His legs barely held him up, but he had no choice. He had to keep moving, had to hide. He glanced around. A dark, empty street. Abandoned buildings, not a soul in sight. Was he really safe? Hobbling and clutching his ribs, his mind churned with thoughts. He needed a plan. But one thing gnawed at him. Why hadn't she tried to stop him? Had she really let him get away? Or was this just another twisted part of her game? One thing was clear. This wasn't over. She was still out there, and she was waiting. Part 7. Crossroads. Jonathan ran, the cold night wind slapping his face, while every step sent pain shooting through his ribs. The streets were dead silent, and the dark windows of the buildings stared back at him like they were judging him. In the quiet, he could swear he heard her footsteps right behind him, steady, measured. She wasn't rushing. She knew he was trapped. He burst onto the main road, trying to figure out where the heck he was. Where was he? He couldn't even remember how he ended up here. Was this a part of the city he knew? Or had she purposely picked this area to make his escape even tougher? A flickering streetlight cast shaky light on the cracked pavement below. A little further down, he spotted a 24-hour gas station. The light inside was on, meaning there were people there. Maybe he could snag a phone and call the cops. His heart pounded as he thought about it. But then again, would anyone believe him? His clothes were soaked, caked in dirt and blood. He looked more like a victim than a guy who'd spent years hunting in the dark. He took a few steps toward the gas station, but then stopped. Something felt off, a choking sense of danger. He glanced back. The street was empty. No one was chasing him, but he knew she was out there somewhere. Deciding not to just bolt into the light, he opted to check things out first. He crept closer, keeping to the shadows. His eyes skimmed over the glass doors of the station. Behind the counter, an old guy was sipping coffee and reading his newspaper, while a young dude in a hoodie browsed the snacks. Everything looked calm. Too damn calm. Jonathan stepped closer to the door, and that's when he saw her. In the reflection of the glass, he caught sight of her standing on the other side of the road, hidden in the building's shadow. Her figure was barely visible in the dark, but he knew it was her. She was staring straight at him. A wave of panic hit him. He took a step back, then paused. If he ran, she'd see it, and then she'd know he was scared. He couldn't let that happen. He had to think. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the gas station. The bell over the door jingled, and the old cashier looked up. "Something wrong, kid?" the cashier asked, eyeing Jonathan's wet, blood-stained appearance. "I need a phone," Jonathan managed, trying to keep his voice steady. The cashier frowned. "What happened to you? An accident? Should I call an ambulance?" "No, just a phone, please, I'll pay." The cashier gave him a once-over, then slowly reached for the landline by the counter. Jonathan was about to grab the receiver when he noticed movement in the side mirror behind the cashier. The door behind him swung open. She walked in. There was no hurry in her eyes. She casually strolled over to the fridge with drinks, grabbed a bottle of water, opened it, and took a sip like nothing was wrong. But in the glass reflection, her gaze met his. Jonathan snatched the phone and quickly dialed 911, but as he pressed the receiver to his ear, only silence answered. "Phone's not working," she said coolly, not even turning to face him. "Did you really think it'd be that easy?" His hands began to shake. The cashier looked puzzled. "What? No, it works. Wait, maybe there's a wiring problem." Jonathan dropped the receiver and backed away. It hit him. He was trapped. She had planned every damn move. Her lips curled into a barely visible smile. "Come on out, Jonathan. We're not done yet." His breathing grew ragged. He knew his only option was to run again. But where to this time? Part 8? No way out? Jonathan lunged for the door, but her voice stopped him, cold. "Don't do it," she whispered softly, almost tenderly. "You know I'll find you anyway." He froze. The cashier and the hoodie-clad kid behind the counter stared in bewilderment, clueless about what was going on. Just a weird clash between two strangers. "Hey, what's going on here?" the cashier grumbled, lowering his newspaper. "Kid, you know this woman." Jonathan wanted to explain, to say something, but his voice was stuck in his throat. He glanced around. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was serious, laser-focused. She knew he was backed into a corner. "I just want to leave," he managed, trying to sound calm. Slowly, she set a bottle of water on the counter, her fingers brushing the plastic ever so lightly. "Leave where, Jonathan? Where do you think you can run? You really think if you bolt right now, I won't catch up to you?" The kid in the hoodie looked around, confused. "Dude, are you okay?" "No," Jonathan replied curtly. He felt as if the floor was shifting beneath his feet. She was telling the truth. He might be able to dash out, but then what? She'd find him again. She always knew where he was, playing with him like a cat with its mouse. The cashier reached under the counter as if looking for something. "If you two are looking for trouble, I can just call the cops." She lifted her head, expression unchanged. "Go ahead and call." Jonathan realized he wasn't getting anywhere here. He couldn't stick around any longer. He turned and bolted for the exit, slamming the door open with his shoulder. His feet slipped on the wet asphalt, but he regained his balance and ran without looking back. The cold air hit his lungs hard. He heard the gas station doors thud shut behind him. She was following, walking, not running, just stalking him. He ducked into a dark alley, knowing it was risky, but he had no other choice. The streets were empty. No taxis, no cars, nothing. It was like the whole city had fallen asleep, leaving him alone with her. Ahead, he spotted a row of abandoned warehouses. He remembered this place. He'd been here before, long ago, when he first learned what death really meant. He dashed through the broken doors of one warehouse, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, it was pitch black, with only the moon casting a pale glow through smashed windows. He hid behind some wooden crates, trying to catch his breath. Silence. Only the wind seeping through the cracks and the sound of his own racing pulse. Then, a sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps. She had entered. "Shelter, Jonathan. Is that your big plan?" Her voice drifted over, calmly, without any tension. "You know I'll always find you. I always do." He fought to steady his breathing, doing his best not to give himself away. He could see her silhouette moving slowly and confidently between the crates. She was savoring every moment. "You know what I'll do if I catch you?" Her voice came closer. "Nah, I'm not going to kill you. You're too damn interesting for that. I want you to feel everything they felt, those who begged for mercy." Jonathan clenched his fists. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't about to let her win. Slowly, he pulled a knife from his pocket. His last chance. His final move. Either he ended this game now, or she'd end him. She edged even closer. Her shadow loomed right in front of his hiding spot. Jonathan took a deep breath, and then he charged forward. Part 9. The final move. Jonathan lunged forward, knife held out in front of him. The blade flashed in the warehouse's dim light, slicing through the darkness as he aimed straight for her chest. He figured if he hit her, this whole nightmare would finally be over. But she was ready. Just before his strike landed, she sidestepped with smooth precision, her body moving like she'd done it 1,000 times. He felt his arm with the knife slide past her, merely grazing her clothes. In the blink of an eye, she snatched his wrist and twisted it hard. A searing pain shot through his joints, and the knife clattered against the concrete. Jonathan tried to break free, but her grip was unyielding. She slammed her knee into his stomach, forcing him to bend over in agony. A ragged breath escaped him as his lungs struggled for air. His heart wasn't pounding from adrenaline. It was pure terror. "I knew you'd try," she whispered, leaning in close. "Killers always do that. They think a desperate lunge makes you a predator. But you lost the moment you decided you could be one." Jonathan gritted his teeth as he fought to stand, but she pressed him down, pinning him with her weight. Her eyes glittered in the darkness, and he finally understood. She was savoring every second. She had led him here. She knew he'd choose this warehouse. She knew he'd fight until the bitter end. "So what now?" he rasped. "Gonna take your sweet time, like you did with the others?" A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "No, Jonathan. I want you to feel fear. Really feel what it means to be prey. And when you finally understand, I'll make sure you vanish. No trace, no evidence, no name. You'll just disappear, just like all the others." His breathing grew fast and ragged as he realized her words weren't just empty threats. They were a promise. For the first time in his life, he was truly scared. She stepped back, releasing him just enough so he could see her cold, unwavering gaze. He knew this wasn't mercy. It was her playing with him, pushing him to make another move, to try and run again. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his fingers barely obeyed. Even if he could reach for the knife lying a few meters away, he knew if he moved, she'd be waiting to strike first. With concrete walls behind him and her looming in front, Jonathan was trapped. "All right," he managed to say, lifting his head. "Then finish it. What are you waiting for? She stared at him silently, her eyes flashing with a mix of curiosity and cruel amusement. You still don't get it, do you? She said, stepping closer once more. I don't kill just for the sake of killing. I kill those who deserve it. And you deserve more than anyone. A deep, paralyzing fear welled up inside him. It wasn't just fear of death, it was the terror of inevitable defeat. He no longer controlled the situation. He was nothing more than a spectator in her twisted game. He knew deep down that he wasn't going to come out a winner. His throat went dry. Please. The word escaped him before he could choke it back. A desperate, instinctual plea for mercy. She smiled then, almost compassionately. Oh, now you're begging. How sweet. Jonathan's eyes darted around, searching desperately for an escape. But there was none. For the first time ever, he wasn't just in danger, he was finished. And he knew it. She leaned in, one more time, her voice barely audible. And now, run. Give me a little more satisfaction. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized her chance wasn't freedom. It was just another twist in the game. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, his knees wobbled, his chest tightened, but his survival instinct kicked in. And he ran. Part 10. The Last Road. Jonathan ran, feeling the cold night air scorch his lungs. His heart was pounding like crazy, and his legs kept tripping over broken debris scattered all over the warehouse floor. He couldn't hear her footsteps behind him, but he knew. She was there. She's always there. He burst out through the shattered doors and sprinted down a street, lit only by the pale glows of distant streetlights. The world looked blurry, reality melting like a bad, twisted dream. He wasn't thinking, just moving forward, desperate for any chance to get away. Then, from behind, he caught a low, muffled laugh. Not loud, but one that cut right through his head. She wasn't running, she wasn't in a rush. She knew he had nowhere to hide. Jonathan turned into a narrow alley, rotten boards, broken windows, and darkness that felt even thicker pressed in around him. His chest tightened, and his heart was thundering in his ears. Suddenly, he spotted a set of metal stairs leading up to the roof of an abandoned building. That was his only shot. He sprang, grabbing the bottom step, and began climbing. His fingers scraped raw against the metal, but he didn't care. He made it onto the roof and spun around. It was empty. She wasn't chasing him. She was just waiting. He took a few steps back, trying to catch his breath, then stopped, a shadow in the dark. She was already there. Why do you keep going? His voice cracked, hoarse and broken. She stood calmly, lit only by the dim glow of the moon. Because you're still alive? You can't just... He gulped air, panic rising in his body. Finish this. Now just do it. She tilted her head. That's not what you really want, Jonathan. You love to be in control, even of your own death. But you can't. He stepped back again and looked down. The roof ended abruptly. Beyond was nothing but a drop, a crumbling cement yard far below. This is your choice. Her voice came almost tenderly. Run until I catch you, or end the game right here, right now. He stared down. The height wasn't instantly lethal, but it was enough to break him, make him completely helpless. And then she'd finish what she started. How's it feel? She asked. The same fear you dished out to them, all those you strangled, slashed, and broke, the fear you once found so damn thrilling. But now it's in you. And it's not letting go. His breathing turned ragged. He couldn't think, couldn't control anything. The game's over, Jonathan. Choose. His legs wobbled. He didn't want to die. But he knew, if he didn't jump, she'd do it for him. And it'd be slow. A moment. Silence. Pure terror. And then he took a step back. The fall was brief. Air burst from his lungs before his body slammed into the concrete. Sharp, all-consuming pain tore through him, forcing him to scream, but his cry was weak, barely audible. His lungs filled with blood as he choked, desperate for just a drop of air. She approached, slowly, deliberately. On tiptoe, she knelt beside him. Her face was eerily calm. See? It was inevitable. Jonathan tried to say something, a rasp, a plea, but his mouth wouldn't work. His vision blurred as he heard her place something next to him, a scrap of paper. "Cops will find you in the morning," she whispered. "And you know what they'll think? That it was you. That you just couldn't take it anymore. That the horrors you inflicted kept chasing you until you broke. They'll buy it. And me, I'll move on." His body shuddered in one final convulsive spasm, as if trying to break free from the inevitable. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to vanish. But the pain was too fierce, and the darkness too thick. The last thing he saw was her silhouette, fading into the night. She left him there, so the world would finally forget him. And then the darkness swallowed him up for good. Moral of the story. This story is a reminder that evil never goes unpunished. Jonathan thought he was the ultimate predator, a cold, ruthless controller of lives. But he only really felt fear when the tables turned. His overconfidence in his own invincibility turned out to be his biggest mistake. When you do evil, don't think it won't come back to bite you. Victims always remember, even if they can't fight back in the heat of the moment, evil always leaves a mark. In the end, the hunter becomes the hunted. Anyone who takes pleasure in other people's suffering is bound to get a taste of it sooner or later. And when that day comes, there's no mercy. Because in the darkness, there's always someone waiting for their turn to even the score.